Tonight, we will be dismissed into business meetings, so please do not let me forget that we need to do that. And my brain is fuzzy today, and so we don't have major things to cover, so I don't think the church is in danger. But help me, as y'all do each time we do business meeting, just to keep us on the up and up and on the same page with things. And then lastly, just the encouragement and the reminder. I know a lot of you have already been signing up for some of the discipleship classes we're offering starting in September in the Sunday evenings. And if you haven't yet, or you don't know about that, or you're not sure, come talk to us, or ask us, or check it out online. Nathan has made, there's a good slide for it. We had a good landing page for that gives a little bit more info and background on what each of the ones are going to be. And so if you haven't signed up for those, please do. I think it'll be really beneficial. Okay, the book of James, the letter of James. If you turn to James chapter 1, verse 1, and then if I could have a volunteer read for us James 1, verse 1. Please do, thank you. Awesome. Okay, so that's as far as we're going to go today, because there's a lot of background, foundation loaded in just that one verse. It will help us. If we don't know it, we can still get a lot out of a study of the letter of James. But knowing the background is helpful, and it gives us some more insight into what it is that James is saying, where he's coming from, and what it might mean for us today. And so we're going to talk about that, and I've broken it down for us today really, really simply. Nathan, if you'll throw that first slide up. Let's talk about the author. If you were to guess who is the author of this, who might you guess? James. Good answer. And I put it in quotes here because as simple as it might be for us to be like, well, James wrote it. It's right here. It says it in the first line. Scholars are divided. James was a very common name in New Testament times, and so it could refer to a whole bunch of people. So if we say, who wrote this? James did. Okay, well, which one? Which James? There were a bunch of them. And then even in the New Testament alone, there are three or four, three that are prominent and four that are mentioned. There's James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, who was an apostle. That's a James. He counts. There's James the Lesser, or James the Younger, son of Alphaeus, also an apostle. If you'd forgotten, there was more than one James that was an apostle. Now you know, or now you remember. There's also James, the half-brother of Jesus, leader of the early church in Jerusalem, and he shows up a lot in the book of Acts. And there's actually another James who's the father of a different apostle, who I think he's the father of Judas, not the bad Judas, the other Judas. Okay. And the reason I get into that is because, okay, we want to clarify, if we mention James, who are we talking about? And no one is 100% sure, but within that, we have enough context clues and also historical tradition, faithful men and women throughout the ages, dating back to the original times, that point us in the direction that we think it's James, Jesus' brother. And so that's what we're going to be working with. That's my personal view. That's what we're going to be working with. Later church tradition, there's a lot of legend that surrounds James, the half-brother of Jesus. He grew into the name or the title James the Just because he became a very, very prominent, powerful in good ways, leader, powerful influence in the early church. He was known for not being rigid, but for being devoted and being devout and being passionate about the faith and the life of faith. So hearing that and knowing that, whether we believe all the legends that surround his name or not, helps give this letter a little more depth and meaning, because he's going to speak very powerfully. He's going to speak very authoritatively, and that's going to come up here in a little bit, and we'll talk, and then as the weeks go by, we'll see how powerful it is. But there's one more detail that I want to bring up. If you remember, in the Gospels, so Mary and Joseph, Jesus' earthly mom and dad, right, have Jesus. And then later, just here and there are these glimpses in the gospel writers where they mention Jesus' brothers and sisters. So as best we understand, because the New Testament doesn't clarify, it's not really interested in exploring that, but there's these hints that he had family, right? He wasn't an only child in that sense. Different father, but you get what I mean there. But what's really interesting, in two places in particular, Mark chapter 3, verse 21, and then John 7, verse 5, it mentions that not all of his family was on board with who Jesus was from the beginning. We see that Mary and Joseph were, importantly so and rightfully so, but not all his brothers and sisters were necessarily. And we don't know. We don't know, again, how many there were and what that looked like for them to grow up with Jesus. The New Testament is not interested in telling us that. Maybe one day in glory we'll find out and we can fill in those details. But what's really interesting for me is if that's who James used to be. He grew up with Jesus, and again, I don't want to speculate what it would look like to be a sibling of Jesus, but the New Testament mentions on 2 occasions that his family came to Jesus, and they were trying to hey, calm down. Hey, can you dial it back? Jesus, you're causing a scene. This isn't respectable. So they weren't really anti-Jesus, but they didn't see it yet. They didn't know who he was necessarily, not all of them. There was some hesitancy, there were some barriers to overcome. And so then what's so beautiful is, I don't know how things played out the way they did, but eventually we get this letter from James, who used to not see Jesus for who he was, at some point somewhere saw Jesus for who he was, and it radically changed the rest of his life. Again, went on to be a leader in the Jerusalem church, eventually was martyred for the faith, wrote this powerful letter, and it's just a really neat testament to who Jesus is and what the life of faith is about. And someone like James, who was right there and didn't see it for so long, finally did, came to faith, and the Lord worked in really amazing ways. And so I fill that in. That gives this, not skin, it's still God's word, it still matters, but hearing that and knowing a little bit of that background adds a little depth and a little oomph to the words that James says, because I know a little bit more about his story. So that's the author, as best I believe and understand, James, the half-brother of Jesus. Secondly, who is he writing to? Yeah, go ahead. According to verse 1, my translation says, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Some of your translations might say the 12 tribes are the people who are scattered amongst the nations, right? Okay. So what on earth does that mean? The most literal, straightforward historical understanding of that term is Jewish Christians who were living outside of the land of Israel. So they were scattered. They were dispersed out into the world. It was a very common way to refer to them, as they were scattered all over the Roman Empire. If you know Old Testament history, we had the 12 tribes of Israel originally, and then the kingdom split into Israel and Judah, and then eventually as history continued to rise and fall, world powers rose and fell. The 12 tribes did not stay the 12 tribes in the same way forever, and eventually through exiles and then coming back and all the other ups and downs of history, people got scattered. So they were still Jewish, they still had the faith and the background and the heritage, but they weren't all physically in the land. However, James now is speaking, and this designation can refer, generally speaking, to God's people, wherever they might be found, or it can refer more narrowly speaking to a certain subsection, a certain group. Maybe they've been scattered to, this area of the world, or that he doesn't specify here. What's good, important for us to see as we go through this, the words he has, to whoever he has in mind, end up applying to that wider, bigger group. But it's, again, good for us to kind of have an idea if he had something in mind. It helps us understand where he's coming from and what he's writing to. And an interesting tidbit before we move on from this part, this is what scholars call a Catholic epistle. And that's not necessarily like Roman Catholic in that sense, but more universal. James does not designate specifically who he's writing to. Paul did, right? To those in Corinth, to those in Ephesus, Timothy, right? This is much more open-ended, and then clearly, obviously, especially for us today, more widely applied. So if you are the people of God, wherever this letter finds you, this is speaking to you. Even though he might have a certain group in mind, which would inform some of the things he says, we find out through the wisdom of God, through the power of the Holy Spirit, the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, these words from James apply to all of God's people everywhere. Thirdly, just for your knowledge, the date. So when was this written? What was going on? What was going on in the world? Again, scholars are not 100% sure or certain or having consensus on. James did not date this necessarily like we do today. But there is a lot of folks who believe this might be the earliest New Testament document that was written. And so the date I threw up is what I kept seeing as I was studying, kind of mid-40s AD. And so, if we're doing the math, Paul, in his letters, were kind of starting to circulate about 10 or 15 years after this, kind of into the 60s and 70s, and the Gospels, I think, around there as well. So what is really interesting about this kind of impacts to how we understand who James is writing to, because in his mind, he's writing to Jewish Christians, but kind of like historically speaking, that's not excluding Gentiles yet, but Paul hasn't really gone on his missionary journeys yet. And so a lot of this is going to have kind of some Jewish elements to it, but Jews and Christians weren't as clearly separate at this point as they are for us now, right? So in his mind, I mean, this was still so new and so fresh. I mean, Jesus had just been there. He had lived, he had died, he rose again, he ascended, and the apostles were left behind in the book of Acts, and the faith is spreading and growing, and it took some time before it really became a very clearly distinct entity, right? So that's just kind of, again, for our knowledge. If some of this sounds Jewish or has a lot of references to the law or some other things, that's okay. James is still pointing the people to Jesus in the midst of that, and it's really fresh. It's really fresh to what was going on. Nothing had really gotten established yet, right? They were still figuring out, what does it look like for us to be faithful to this Jesus? So it wasn't the established church, and they didn't have the centuries of tradition like we do today. So there was this really fresh element to it, and that really inspires or really informs, I believe, what James has to say and why he's writing. We're going to get to that in just a second. We go to the next slide. So what are the circumstances? What's the occasion? Why did James feel led to write? Very simply, I put down, life is hard. And as we go through the letter, we're going to see him address just life is difficult. And it's difficult for God's people, and that's okay. And so if we keep in mind the options here of who James might have been writing to, if he's writing to one group in particular, according to the book of Acts chapter 8, verse 1, and also verse 11, or chapter 11, verse 19, it mentions how after Stephen was stoned to death, these early Christians were not always getting along with their Jewish brothers and sisters, right? There was persecution that arose, and sometime, really, really horrific persecution. Saul, who became Paul, was a big part of this, right? And so a lot of Christians in Jerusalem area, for example, again, coming from a Jewish background, would have still considered themselves Jewish, but now are followers of Jesus, didn't have a home anymore. They were at odds with their community because they had given their life to Christ. And so a lot of them got sent out. So it might be then that James was thinking specifically of them. Because think about it, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have newspapers and TV and phones and access to information or to each other like we do now. So if they had lived in one area, had come to faith in Jesus in that area, had the disciples there, had other, early first believers there, but now can't be there, they're cut off. What are we going to do? Well, what does it look like for us to, they didn't have Bibles like we have Bibles. How do we follow Jesus when we don't have the apostles around to tell us? We don't have our faith community around to work with. What are we going to do? And life is really hard. How do we remain true? And so James is speaking to that. So that's an option. But then, again, in the wisdom of God and the power of the Spirit, his words, even if they were intentionally focused on a particular group, we're going to find that they apply across the board because they speak to the human experience of all of God's people. You're going to have these experiences in life, these difficulties, these hardships that you're going to face that are not unique to any time or place. So let me give you some general examples of some of the difficulties that James is going to address. Social issues, social standing, relating to people outside of the faith, unbelieving bosses, for example. Other relational issues dealing with fellow believers. How do we talk to each other? How do we engage or disagree with each other? He's going to talk a lot about, we're going to come back to this in a second, finances, economics, poverty and wealth. And what do I do if I got a lot of stuff? What do I do if I don't have any and I'm just trying to get by? Physical health will come up. Ethical issues in terms of attitudes and behaviors, what we say, what we do, how we treat rich people, how we treat poor people, and everything in between. So James writes to help the people know how to navigate life well. Life is hard, but there's hope, and there is guidance, and there is direction, and God has raised up leaders like James to show and to share and to help guide the people. And that leads to the next point, purpose. So why did he write? So yes, life is hard. That's nothing new. Maybe there's one group in particular that was really struggling that James, as a pastor, his heart went out to. So what is he doing? He wants to encourage them. He wants to inspire them. He wants to challenge them, all Christians anywhere, whether life is really good or life is really bad or you're somewhere in between. This faith you have in Jesus, live it out. Live it out. So don't just talk about it and don't just think about it, but put it into action. And he's going to talk a lot about faith and works and how that plays out. You can say all day long you believe one thing, but until I see it, maybe those are just empty words. And so, how do you navigate life? Well, I'm going to show you, and it's not going to be just lip service or just mental ideas. Jesus has brought you to life, and there is a life for you to live. And so I want to show you. I want to encourage you if you're struggling or you're stressed or you're worried or you're miserable. I want to encourage you along. And if you're on the other end, if you're causing stress or misery for others, I want to challenge you to cut it out. Or wherever you might find yourself on this road of discipleship following Jesus, keep going, keep going. Put your faith into action. All right. So that's kind of some key historical background, contextual background. I'm going to spend about 10, 15 minutes talking about three key themes that we're going to see show up over and over and over. It's interesting. We will see here, and I'm trying not to read too much into this or speculate or let my imagination run, but it's interesting the way that James talks about the life of faith compared to like a Paul, for example. They're both passionate. They both have really good things to say. They were both key leaders in the early church movement, but they have very different approaches. Some people have suggested you can tell that James was Jesus' brother because he doesn't seem as impressed. He does recognize fully that Jesus is Lord, he's Savior, so it's not an issue of faith and belief, but he feels like a brother. Like there's this, I don't know, he doesn't talk about Jesus as much. He's not as interested as Paul, for example, some scholars would say, in theology and in teaching and explaining like who Jesus is and what he did. That might be true to an extent, but it's not that this is then devoid of theology, but if you keep in mind who we believe James was writing to, and as compared to Paul, because he gets compared to Paul a lot. Who was Paul in his letters writing to? Gentiles. What did they know about God? Did they have centuries of heritage and legacy to draw on? They were brand new, right? And so Paul's like, let me just explain how it connects. And sometimes Paul does pull in often Old Testament ideas and imagery, right? Paul was a Jew. He had that background, and it mattered for Gentiles. It matters for all of us. This is God's world, God's big story. But they needed explaining. They needed to be told what happened and why it mattered and where it came from and all of that, and then push it into, so here's how you live in light of that. James most likely was talking to people who already knew the story. They knew the doctrines. They knew the key ideas, but how do I live it out? What do I do with it? And that's where he really focuses. So it's not like he doesn't care about theology. He's going to talk a lot about who God is and what God's like. He's going to talk about sin and where it comes from and what it does to us. But that doesn't seem to be his key focus. He relies on that. That's part of it. But he has kind of different focuses in mind. And there are different scholars, depending if you're doing research, who kind of arrange or organize James in different ways. I don't believe that James sat down like he's writing a textbook. You know, in 2,000 years, there's going to be a church of folks who are working through my material. Let me give them headings. I don't think that was his mindset. And so let's not get too rigid with how we arrange James. But that being said, there are two scholars that I have come across, Blomberg and Kamel, who organize it according to these three themes I'm about to share with you. And I find it really helpful for my mind, for me understanding the message of James. Because all the other little things that he mentions kind of fall under these key themes. And these three overlap. And we're going to see him get introduced. Yeah, you can put that first one up if you want. We'll see him introduced next week as we start getting into chapter 1. All three will show up in chapter 1, and then they'll just keep showing up in different ways throughout the rest of the letter as he expounds upon these three key themes. So here's the first one, trials in the Christian life. And this is wonderful because this, again, applies to anyone, anywhere, at any time. Life is not easy. Our world is not perfect. God is doing something about it. So how do I then live in light of that? And James is going to talk to that, and he's going to speak to that. And before we move on to the next one, I do want to ask us, just generally speaking, can you think of some examples of individual personal trials that a Christian might go through in life? Share them out loud. So sickness, yeah, absolutely. Do what? Sure, yeah, sickness that leads to death sometimes, so dealing with some of that loss, that personal loss. Can you think of any other trials? Persecution. Yeah, absolutely, that'd be difficult. And that can look a billion different ways, right? On the one extreme end, that can mean death. Sometimes it's just kind of harassment and you're just at odds and uncomfortable. It can play out in a lot of different ways, but that's absolutely something Christians go through and have gone through. What else can you think of? Any individual, whether you or just in general, trials that a Christian might face in this world, in this life. How many of you, upon becoming a Christian, knew exactly what to do in every situation ever since then? Okay, yeah. Sometimes it's just maturity, growing. Okay, I love Jesus. I believe he is who he said he is. I believe he did what the scriptures tell me he's done. I receive it. I'm ready for it. But I don't necessarily know what that looks like tomorrow when I go to work or when I'm dealing with my family. I have the faith. God has put it in my heart. I've responded however you want to talk about it. But now what do I do with it? I've been saved, but I'm not in heaven yet. How do I live? How do I be faithful? Yeah, absolutely. That's a big part of the Christian life. So sometimes it's difficulty from outside, attacks in various ways, temptation or persecution or just difficulty in a broken, fallen world. And then sometimes it's just, well, I'm ignorant or I'm foolish or I don't know or I've goofed or whatever it might be. So trials inside and outside. But what about, let's take it to another level. Can you think of any trials or challenges, difficulties, hardships, whatever you want to call it, that not just individual Christians might face, but groups of Christians, churches, local bodies of believers? What hardships might they face? Conflict? What kind of conflict and disagreements? From where? From who? About what? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, that's getting very personal for Baptists, what color carpet we should have. Yeah. But yeah, so internal, within the body of believers, there's going to be conflict and disagreement because we're not all the same. As the gospel of Jesus Christ advances and calls anyone and everyone from any and every background to come to new life in him, you're going to have a mix and a mash of a lot of different types of folks, right? And it's it's possible for there to be unity, for there to be peace. Paul talks about it a lot, but it's not always easy, right? So internal, within the body of believers, disagreements, conflict, issues, but then outside as well, as we encounter a world that doesn't understand or that disagrees or does not value the things that we value as citizens of God's kingdom, right? So absolutely conflict. Can you think of anything else? Any trials that groups of Christians might face in this world? Have any of y'all ever just been exhausted? Because you're doing the things you're supposed to be doing, and it doesn't seem to be working, and so I'm discouraged, or we're discouraged, God, or we're really hanging in there best we can, but we're not growing. We're not having new salvations. Is it us? Is it our problem? Have we failed? Is it our community? God, we got questions. Or God, it's just been a really, really hard season, and our folks are good, and we love you, but we're poor. And we're trying to make ends meet individually, much less together, right? And so there are all sorts of different things. We're just giving examples. So James is going to speak to these things, some of these very directly, and some of them he's going to give us principles that apply to help guide us through these sort of situations. Last questions about this before we move on to the next theme. If you're not prepared to face hardship in this world, what's going to happen? Some folks leave the faith altogether. Yeah, Nathan and I were actually talking about this today. We're talking about famous or I guess celebrity Christians who have walked away from the faith as soon as they hit like that first question they didn't understand. And we're just both kind of laughing, kind of heartbroken, laughing that Christians have been facing these issues for like hundreds of years, and your faith was just this shallow. As soon as you hit difficulty, you bounce. I think God has called us to something deeper, not easier or smoother, but deeper. If we're not prepared to face difficulty in this world, it's going to crush us. If we are prepared to face it, even if it's not specifically, I'm prepared for this particular issue, I'm ready, it doesn't make life easier, but we can navigate it, and we can keep going. That's part of like parenting, and that's part of growing up. There are things that we are going to teach my children, that I'm trying to teach my children. There's no way I could possibly prepare Baylor, for example. He starts school next week, for everything he's going to face when he goes to school as he grows up. There's no way. I don't even know. Like, the world is changing so rapidly. I'm young and I'm already too old, right? So he's going to face stuff that I have no idea what to do about it, but I can prepare him. I can shape his mind, his heart, and his character with the help of God and the power of the Spirit to be ready to face it. So when you do run up against that, as hard as it might be, or as confusing or as painful as it might be, it doesn't crush you. You can keep going and you keep trusting God, right? James is going to help the people do that. All right, second major theme definitely plays into this one, wisdom. Wisdom. Now, let me ask you all this. Is there a difference? There is, between wisdom and knowledge. And if there is, what's that difference? How do you differentiate the two? Okay. Okay, so you said knowledge is like knowing things, and then wisdom is knowing what to do with those things that you know, essentially. Yeah, absolutely. So why then might we need wisdom in life? Do what? Okay, to kick out bad knowledge. That's good. Sonny, what were you saying? Because we're not wise. Yeah, because we don't have it. Sure. Was someone else saying something? Why? How is wisdom helpful in this life? Why might it be important for our lives? Discernment? Talk to me about that. What does that mean? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So much information to process is what you said. So what do we do with it? How do we sort through it? And then how do we, again, James's emphasis is, what are you going to do with these things that you know? It's good. It is proper. It's important to know the right things. Absolutely. The Bible is very clear on knowing and believing the right things. But then what are you going to do about it? Are you going to live them out? And then if you are, how are you going to do it? Because we can say all day long, this is very popular these days, and it's not new to our moment in history. I just want to love people and love others. Good. I hope you do. So what does that mean? Give me an example. I just want to love Jesus and love others. Okay, yes, I know this. Good. Or even my own heart. Like, we're called to serve others. What does that mean and what does that look like? Okay, we need wisdom. We need God to guide us, help us be able to process information, help us be able to read society and the age, the times that are happening, help us understand our own faulty motives, and we need help. And it's not just about knowing all the right things and having all the right information and being able to, like a test, rattle off what's right. What are you going to do with it? How is it going to impact your life? How is it going to help you know Jesus more, live for him more, spread his name and his kingdom more? We need wisdom. And there are going to be times in this life, you've probably already recognized, when the answer isn't clear cut, or when they're like competing, not even two, like 3 or 4 possible directions you could go. Sometimes in life, it's real clear. That's bad, that's wrong, that's sinful, that's going to end poorly. Avoid that. A lot of times we still need help seeing that, but sometimes we see that. But then a lot of times it's, we could go any of these directions. They're not necessarily wicked or sinful, but maybe one is more God-honoring, or maybe one in this moment is the better choice. Well, how do we know that? How do we decide that? How do we discern that? We need wisdom. And James is going to talk all about that and how that then impacts everything else that we do in life. All right, last theme here. Riches and poverty. Riches and poverty. Um, Many of the people in the original context that James was writing to were most likely desperately poor. And as you can imagine then, that plays into number one, and they desperately needed number two, because what do we do about this? And then how do we hold these things in tension of like, we believe God's promises, He's faithful, He's the giver of all good things, as we will see, He provides for us. We know eternity is coming, eschatology, the end times, God making all things new. We know that's coming. We know we get to be a part of it because of Jesus. But what do we do in the meantime? I got mouths to feed. Or I got a boss who is just breathing down my neck and he's crushing me. Or I did the work. I'm willing to put in the work to make a way in this world for my family. My boss ripped me off. Or I got cheated. What do we do about this? Okay, or we're gathered to worship together, and we got some really rich folks, and we got some really poor folks, and a whole lot of folks in the middle. Man, we're really different. And outside these walls, wherever we're gathered, the world reminds us and keeps us different. So what does it look like for us to be together? What does it look like for us to be brothers and sisters on the same level, on the same page before our King? We don't know. They didn't know. And how do we navigate this? So we need wisdom, and we need to understand this is part of the difficulty of living a Christian, faithful life in this broken world until we are fully redeemed. So James is going to talk about it, and he's going to have some really strong words to say, both of comfort and challenge. And so we'll get to that. And then for us today, my hope, by the time we get through the end of this, is it helps us kind of reorient how we view this topic. We often view it real shallowly, kind of, not wrongly, but shallowly in terms of just dollars and cents, like bank accounts. Like how much money do you have or not have? And that's part of it, right? But hopefully we recognize there's more to it than that. Because in some sense, I could consider myself poor next to some of you maybe, but then like compared to a brother or sister in other parts of the world right now, I am obscenely wealthy. I don't have to question my drinking water, ever. I could drink any water from anywhere in my house, right? I don't have a swimming pool, so I'm poor, but I have food in my fridge, and if I don't, I can go get some easily. So maybe we don't need to think purely in those terms. Maybe this is kind of more of a mindset and how we view our resources and the things God has given us. And if we start thinking those ways, that will include money. That will include the trappings that come with money, good or bad, social status, that kind of thing. But it also will free us up to start looking at things differently. How can I be a good steward with whatever it is that God's given me in this life? And how can I not just be grateful for whatever He's given me, but how then can I live in a way that blesses others who may not have what I have? So that can include money, material things. That can include relationships, support. Real quick, this is unrelated, but this is kind of related, and then we'll be done, I promise. It's been a couple years now, but I went to, I don't know if it was a seminar, I can't remember what it was, some meeting for pastors, and we're talking about this issue because there's a big charity event coming up, and they threw up this infographic on the screen that has just haunted me in good ways ever since. And they had polled, I don't know who they were, but someone had polled a lot of stereotypically poor people and asked them to define, what does it mean for you to be poor? What are you lacking? And they asked wealthy people, non-poor, those who are above the poverty line, what does it mean for you when you think of poor? What does that mean? Those above the poverty line thought in terms of financial resources, money, that kind of thing. Those below the poverty line, that wasn't even at the top of the list. That was included, but much further. You know what they were lacking most? Relationships, opportunities, other human connections. So when we recognize poverty and wealth is not just about things, but it's also about flourishing, it gives us a wider understanding of how then we can bless those that don't have what we have. So we'll get to that. I'm very excited. This is a great book. All right, any thoughts or questions on any of this tonight? Wonderful, okay. Let's talk over our prayer list, spend some time in prayer, and then we'll get to a business meeting after that. Okay. Does everyone have a prayer list that wants one? Because if not, Steve's got some extras.